Hello, this is Dean Blake, and this is another podcast of mine. I'm going to try to break this up into chunks. I'd like to give the Democrats some advice that I think that they're very, very unlikely to make use of, even if they were to hear it, unfortunately. We're in a position right now where it looks like we may have lost the democracy. We may get to have a midterms vote, but it'll probably be very heavily influenced by illegal voter suppression and a variety of other things that will tilt things very much in the favor of the Big Orange, which is what I'll call him. And the truth is that in hearing this, a person might think that I'm entirely identify as a Democrat or I'm on the Democrat side. Well, I'm on the left, and that is definitely true. And although at first I thought I would make this podcast series apolitical and that I wouldn't reveal what my real politics were and just try to show a philosophical basis for morality that informs me in my politics. But time's growing short, and I'm a busy guy, and the world seems to be kind of falling apart. So I'm going to give it to you straight as to what I think that the Democrats should do, because I think they're the better party. But in doing that, it's impossible to not talk about all the problems that they've had and how they are, in a very real sense, the cause of their own misery. And it isn't just their misery. Unfortunately, it's ours too. They've made some consistent mistakes over a long period of time throughout my lifetime, and I'm in my 50s. So here we go. I think that Donald Trump, the Big Orange, is really more the symptom of a disease than its cause. Although in this case, such things are recursively looped, and he helps to spread more of the disease and make more of it happen at the same time as, in a sense, being picked out of the crowd almost as a creation of it, of the phenomena. The truth is that villains are always waiting in the wings. There'll always be bad guys. There's always a Hitler waiting someplace to take the throne. There's never going to be a shortage of evil people who want to do evil things and just enjoy having power over other people so much that they're willing to sacrifice the world, if need be, in order to have a little more love from it. And that sounds paradoxical, but think about how it's worked, and it really is true. He's kind of the anti of what we represent Jesus as being when that's at its best, when we see him as being a progenitor of mercy, love, and forgiveness, particularly upon the weak and the poor, and without regard to their religious beliefs or ethnicity, which he showed abundantly, if we're to believe, with the proposition that we believe that he was a real guy and existed. He's kind of the opposite of that. Donald Trump is the opposite of that. He isn't a man who would sacrifice himself so that the world would love itself more. He is the opposite. He would sacrifice the world in order for himself to be loved by it more. And that seems to be his mission and his purpose. Nonetheless, his followers, the fallen away, still view him as being a Messiah. And there's no doubt about that. The phrase that he is that doesn't really cross their lips in public very much. You hardly ever see it spoken aloud. But it would really take an ignoramus not to understand that is the mutual understanding that most of them hold, especially when they come at it from a more religious point of view. They think he's the second coming. And you just take a look at the man and who they picked for that, as though they could pick who that is, if again, assuming that it would be someone. It's kind of ridiculous. Now, I'm beginning to hedge into some spiritual beliefs, and I want to make clear that I'm not a biblical literalist, and I'm deeply in favor of science. But at the same time, that doesn't interfere with the type of spiritual beliefs that I hold, and I'm not a Satanist. So I do have some religious beliefs, but that doesn't interfere with my ideas about the world and how I'm informed about how the world works. Science is a good explainer for how the world, the material world that we find ourselves in, works, right? So beyond that, although I could go into a long diatribe about it, let's just say that I'm not a huge fan of organized religion, and that I don't really find the need in this particular place and time to explain myself further. Neither do I assume that all other people are of the same opinion or belief that I am. I'm going to drink some coffee here. Okay, so to summate it in brief, the Democrats need to kind of do two things. They need to, and the two go together, three really. They need to stop doing the things that caused Donald Trump to arise in the first place. And in doing that, they need to accept that they have played a role in his emergence, that it is not just some evil bad guys, right, that caused him, and that because there's evil bad guys that he's there. The truth is the evil bad guys have always been there, and the Democrats are meant to act as a shield, to act as the good guys, to protect us from the bad guys. That's usually what good guys are for. And you can blame it on the bad guys when they make it into the castle or the encampment or whatever. It is their fault, but blame is not really like a pie that gets less of it when you share it around. The truth is that we have these people that were supposed to be standing up for us and acting on our behalf in good faith, kind of at a figurative bargaining table, who really didn't do their job since the early 1990s, by and large, just taken as a whole, and kept saying that compromise was the value to be leaned on. And I would say that if compromise is the only value that you lean on, all the other values and principles that you had will depart and be traded away for something. And in the end, compromise is all that you're left with. And like a rock that you're clinging to in the tide as it rises, sooner or later you're going to drown. And I think that that's what's happened. The Democrats sold the future through the 1990s and early thousands. And then eventually the future happened. They sold it to make temporary progress, at least in the success of getting votes back in those days. And it still didn't work very well. And then because of things like the WTO, for example, and their role in that, now we all pay the price. So let me just say that, to put it out there while I'm still thinking of it, that we went through that period, through the early thousands, from the 1990s, from a low percentage of people being in the service sector. It's like it was alarming when it was at 35% in the early thousands. And it went from there, and I think the classical number is more like 15%, but don't quote me on that. But I do know, I remember when 35% mark was hit, and it was the most rapidly expanding sector of the economic stratum, as in terms of types of work, and that was alarming some people. And then all of a sudden, in around 2007, right before the big crash, it bloomed up to 80% of the working population, and has remained there ever since. At first, there was a lot of unemployment after the big crash, but it bounced back. But when it bounced back, those other sectors of employment never did. The real reason for that is because of the WTO, because the WTO was a way of paving the way. It was a document signed by a lot of different countries, including the United States. Not everybody. They intended for the whole world to be signatories to it. That didn't really work. And some nation states, in resisting the pressure to do that, formed into economic blocs. Right? And there's a variety of them. They kind of break apart and form with different constituents. But that seems to be kind of the way of the future. The European Union being a very early one. It happened long before the WTO, but it serves as a kind of template for the African Union and the relationship between Brazil and India, for example, that kind of thing. Those are the attempts. And the reason why is because it lays weaker nation states economically. It leaves them bare to being taken advantage of, and in particular their populations. It means that we can get very cheap labor from other countries. And it also meant, because we are in competition with that labor more and more, that our labor becomes cheaper and cheaper as well. It was designed and intended to hurt the labor market globally for the vendors of labor, the workers, and to help out the buyers, as though the buyers of that labor needed that help when they did not. I would argue they did not need that help. They always want it. They always figured that they need it. They want that labor to be cheaper. But when the labor is cheaper, what does it do to the consumer market? Right? It's a complicated question. I'm not going to go into all the ins and outs of the WTO. Let's just say that because of the WTO, you have these changes in the local labor markets here in Europe and the United States in particular, where we're faced with a situation where we have unprecedented levels of employment, but most of the employment, about 80% of it, will not pay the bills, will not pay rent, as well as for food and for clothing. And it leaves people in a very desperate state, and they wonder what is wrong. But, okay, so I apologize for the edit. Something was going on in the background, but where were we? So people have become very unhappy with their what their employment provides. Jobs are very plentiful. In fact, right now, as I say this, there's really a problem in the job market in that there's not enough workers. But you'd think that in a marketplace that would drive up the price of labor. It does not in ours. And the rational thing that you're supposed to do with capitalism, real capitalism, cannot be done because of the way that the banking system is set up, because of the way that business loans work. These things, hardcore capitalists in the modern sense, in the conservative sense, will argue that everything that's good for rich people or that they would like is somehow capitalism. And of course, rich people had their heyday when we had kingships, and the wealthy were the distributors of both law as well as wealth and loans. Kings acted in a way like banks, but also like judges, and had the power of enforcement, and were therefore above the law. They were supposedly not above the theocracy that ruled over them, but they proved themselves independent of that as well. And that is exactly what conservatives are pushing us towards, a system that is overseen by a theocracy that rules over a set of very wealthy people who are above the law. That's just landed gentry system. And as Adam Smith would have it, that is not capitalism, and that there are problems with it that prevent proper capitalism, like, for example, competition and a lack of monopolies and things like that. So, and a proper ability for prices for things, including labor, to move up or down according to relative demand. I don't really believe that capitalism was ever meant to act in a way that was completely unrestrained by a democratic government. And a democratic government is naturally going to institute some things that such people will probably refer to as being socialist in some way, although not necessarily Marxist. And that's another distinction that we don't necessarily recognize today. There's a whole slew of economic tools that could be at our disposal that are well proven and used by cultures and economies very similar to our own in Northern Europe. And instead of all of these tools being forbidden because they're somehow to the left of some line, and then the line keeps moving further and further to the right, we need to recognize them as not being really a gestalt. It's not really a collection taken by itself. Those northern Teutonic countries, they don't all use the same set of tools. In fact, there's quite a variety there between like Sweden and Denmark and Norway. They're not all the same. And so seeing it as being like a tool belt with a variety of tools in it that we can pick and choose from according to what we need and what we can see that they do in other countries with some expectations of results is a better way to look at that. But of course, again, the Democrats have been terrified of even discussing that for years, and the Republicans have been very busy trying to make it out so that that is somehow the machinations of the devil. And that's not hyperbole. At the religious side of the Republicans, they really do try to push the idea that capital markets are somehow of divine origin, and that anything that seeks to constrain them or the wealthy people that benefit from those markets is anti-God and anti-Christian. And this is a huge problem when you're trying to make rational decisions about marketplaces and economic rules, right? So instead of going off here about what I see as being a utopia and a better world, let me just give the Democrats some advice in the meantime. Pulling more towards the center is just going to make everyone angry. More conservative politics are only going to benefit the more conservative candidates, and those are the Republicans. And they can outdo you in terms of being conservative and do it better than you can, considering what those conservative people actually want, because what they want isn't necessarily all that rational at this point. It has more to do with feelings. That is part of how they have been fooled, and you allowed them to be fooled. That's part of the problem here. The Democrats need to get on board with the new communication machinery. They need to get on board with the new media completely. They need to dive right into it, not toe deep, not ankle deep, but all the way. And this needs to supplant the means that they have of funding their campaigns, because there's plentiful money there. The format that I suggest is not Facebook or Twitter, and I'm not going to call it the other thing. It's YouTube, and the reason why is because it gives both visual as well as audio information, and in doing so, it can be very long format. It can go on for a while. You can have a multi-hour long video if you need to, or just a few minutes or even a few seconds. And that's of tremendous advantage because those other types of media sites like Facebook and Twitter put constraints on what it is that you can show and the length of what you can present. Facebook just isn't really it's useful to have accounts on those things, but as the source and origin of the material that you wish to convey, YouTube is better. And to do this, they'll really need to have all of the Democrats on board. If you're going to be a part of the Democratic Party, you got to have a YouTube channel, and it should be the way that people primarily make money for their campaigns and that the DNC makes money for itself. And they need to replace the system of rich and wealthy donors that they currently have as their main source of revenue. This is a much better way of reaching people and voters than knocking on doors or even holding rallies. It is, in a sense, a note from the playbook from the other side. It's something they picked up on and did in a very dirty, sloppy way that the Democrats can do much better. And they picked up on it early on, essentially when President Obama failed to do so. It was sort of like he fumbled the football, and he was our generation's greatest orator. And during a crucial moment when he had a public mandate but was losing it in the public field, he went and tried to strong-arm other members of the Democratic Party where they didn't see him in a leadership role even though he was supposed to be one. And this was during the whole Obamacare ACA thing. When they were trying to get that done, it was pretty obvious that all he needed to do was to keep doing what he did during his campaign when he achieved that public mandate. Only this time he was going to have to do it in a kind of debate scenario, if somewhat remotely, because you have counter-opposition, in this case, arguing directly against that mandate. But if he acquired it in the first place during an election season, he ought to be able to do it when he's president. busy as a president is, he would have at least been able to carry through his agenda through that period of time by delegating some authority when it came to other tasks, and at least spending a couple hours, 2 or 3 days a week, just talking to the public through a YouTube format, through a video, about in essentially the same way that he did when he was campaigning, but that was on the TV, because that was really kind of the moment of transition. It had been going on for a long time, but it was kind of a threshold moment where the political media and discourse shifted away from the more tightly controlled and constrained confines of old media, the television mostly. And the newspapers were melting away and shifted over into things that were a lot more fluid, a lot more instantaneous, and whose memory essentially can last forever on the internet. And most of that has gone on through YouTube because, otherwise what are you doing? Sifting through tweets, and the tweets are just like a half a paragraph long, and you can't really explain anything through a tweet. It's just a way of making a quick jibe or a joke or something, right? So this is the new media, and there are people who talk about politics and talk about economics who make a living on this media. And if they can make a living on this media, to say that it's too costly to do is ridiculous. More, if you have a few people helping you out, a camera person, an editor that, you would need to pay, you can do that through a Patreon account attached to the YouTube account. We're just talking about what YouTubers do. And there's also a couple other donation systems like Coffee. This would need to be jibed up with campaign donation laws. And if that were done, then they would have more than enough money in their coffers to run a campaign. If a YouTuber can make a living off of it, they can fund a campaign off of it. I know that doesn't sound right because maybe the money doesn't match up, but think about it. You're saving a lot of money by being able to campaign on the same platform that you're also making money off of. And it opens up other further donation venues or avenues. And it was Bernie Sanders that really came along and proved this. And when the Democrats tried to take the information that Bernie Sanders had about donators, it never really worked for them to give them money. And the reasons why was A, they didn't use the new media. Instead, they tried to use email. Like, people still use it for business purposes, but no, everybody just puts a campaign thing into their spam filter. It goes into the spam bucket. And so that didn't really do any good. And personally, none of the politicians that were using the Bernie Sanders email list were appealing to me because none of them were really saying anything remotely like what Bernie Sanders was saying. And Bernie Sanders, unlike all other Democrats at the time, was admitting that we were in trouble, that we had full employment, but that the employment was inadequate to give us the means to have opportunities and even just a life when it came to rent and other bills that needed to be paid to upkeep and maintain the kind of life that you need to have in order to continue working. He acknowledged in a roundabout way that the current economic model is not indefinitely a socially sustainable model. On a social level, it will tear itself apart. And of course, that's what we're watching right now. How did the Republicans succeed? They succeeded because they used the damage done by the WTO. And instead of pointing out the WTO, they blamed it on Mexican migrants, as though people coming here to work somehow was upending the type of crappy labor that was available. And instead of taking a look at how our products are actually made. And we know that a good third or so of the labor that goes into making our cell phones and clothing and other stuff is very likely made by people who have an average age of 14. And I can't prove this to you, but there's past statistics that I've read that show this, but you can go ahead and doubt it. But go ahead and take a good look into it. Like about a third of the labor is paid for through third-party payout systems from the factory. That means someone else is being paid. The average age, and it's a years old statistic that I recollect is that the average age of the worker, and I read this in a Hernando de Soto book, that he's an economist. He's not really a far left economist by any means. He's kind of conservative. But what he said was, at the time, and this was years ago, that the average age of the workers are 14 years old out there in the world where we make use of this third world labor. And the average gender is female, and it shouldn't be a surprise. It's concentrated south of our border here in the United States and over in Southeast Asia, and these days in China. These people are not workers, they are slaves. They are slaves. That's not me being hyperbolic. The money goes elsewhere. And very oftentimes, if you look at it, you find out that there's a lot of on-site compounds where people, once they're in there, they can't really leave. And the reason why they're put in there by their parents is because their parents get in debt to the wrong people, not a bank, but just some loan shark. And it's the loan shark that's receiving the money for the labor of the child. And then average age of 14 means that you've got kids in there that are 11, 12, 13 years old too. And they don't really live very long once they're there on the factory floor. Who knows how they get rid of the bodies, but if it's Southeast Asia, maybe speculatively there's a backhoe that they used to just dig a ditch out back or whatever. They literally have netting at the top of the buildings to prevent people from committing suicide and falling to their death. That's who makes our cell phones. And yet at the same time, we lose out on that labor and make less money on what labor is available, specifically because we allowed it to be outsourced. And the Republicans are allowed to use that state of affairs to win elections because they have found a scapegoat, a false one, which would be Mexican labor coming up here, really South American and Central American labor. And it's instead of going after the employers who employ illegal labor, which they could do, they never talk about that. No one, not even the Democrats, talks about that. How that's essentially tax evasion most of the time. It's tax evasion. And yeah, they could put those people away with a federal crime into federal prison for a long, long time, and you'd see an end to that real quickly. But instead, they blame it on the individual people, poor families, people trying to get food for their children who run up here hoping for a better life, fleeing from tyranny, fleeing from gangs, fleeing from despotic dictators who have death squads who go around and kill people that disagree with them, including families. Not crazy people from sanitariums, not the criminal gangsters. Some of those people, if there's enough people coming up here, are going to filter through too. But by and large, the average story is going to be just a person who's trying to make money for their family and survive. How can you blame them for wanting the same thing that you want? Just because they have a different color skin and talk different? But the Republicans have managed to use this yet again, because it's kind of an old story, in order to win. What would it take to provide a medicine for this, a remedy for this? Well, you have to point out that there is a problem. And you have to identify what the real cause of that problem is. But for the Democrats to do that, they would need to fess up and admit what it is that they did and the role that they played in having the problem come about in the first place. And so far, none of them have had the guts to do that. If the Republican Party is the party of corruption, where they sanctify corruption as being a virtue, then you need to have an equal and opposite force, an opposing force that is for integrity and is suggesting rules and laws that would be for integrity. Things like term limits and making sure that lobbyists can't get money to politicians, doing something about the fortunes of politicians when they use their political insider knowledge to increase their fortunes because it causes a conflict of interest. Problems like Nancy Pelosi and her stock portfolio that I guess made like 67% yield That kind of thing needs to be a thing of the past. And this is one of the reasons why they haven't gotten online. This is one of the reasons why they are not, for several hours every week, getting online to explain themselves to people, to talk about their vision of the future, their principles along the way, the means and the steps that they can take to get that future, and the current legislation that they're working on. The reason why they're unwilling to do that is because it means having to be directly transparent and debate people who might criticize them, not just on the right, but also on the left, and hold fast to their ideas or be willing to change them and admit to the things that they've done and what effect it really has. To have that rational discourse in order to formulate a plan based on things that actually work or are proven to work by discarding the things that don't. Which is the only way you can build a building or a bridge or a spaceship. And we ought to be working the same thing the same way with our politics. If they represent the side of reason instead of irrationality, then that's what they need to do. But to do that means having to take a risk. And I think that the real reason why the current crop of Democrats has been unwilling to do that is because they're just unwilling to take that risk. They're unwilling to make that leap. They would need to cast aside the money from rich donors. Not necessarily refuse them, but they would at least have to look elsewhere for the money, because most likely it wouldn't be coming in from there anymore. And the only way to do that is to get it from the public. And the only way to do that is to set up an easy way for the public to donate to them and expect small donations from people. But to do that, you have to convince them. And to do that, you have to talk to their priorities and their needs. And the truth is that means having to explain and discuss what needs to be corrected. And what needs to be corrected, the Democrats are partly responsible for going back through the 1990s. So we need a new crop of Democrats or some political party that's willing to do that. Because whatever political force is willing to get online and have that discussion in that venue writes the future, wins the future, will have the future. And time is growing short. There's a window of opportunity. If it hasn't already closed, it's going to close. Anyway, this is Dean Blake. That's all I have to say for today. Thank you for listening.